Thank you, Alexander and Meredith. And thank you to everyone at Hauser Wirth who made this possible. And thank you to Larry, who instigated this show. He came up with the idea of this show because most people don't know that much about these plexiglass sculptures that were made by John Chamberlain in Larry Bell's studio, because most people think of John Chamberlain as, for his much better known massive sculptures of smashed car parts that he had, for which he's best known. But Chamberlain was full of surprises. I'm going to start a little bit with Chamberlain because I learned a lot about John Chamberlain, researching this to talk to Larry. He was the sixth generation of a family of saloon keepers from rural Indiana. He was in the Navy at age 16 to avoid going to jail. He stayed in the Navy for 3 years, got out, and started working as a hairdresser. And with that as his background, he found his way to the Art Institute of Chicago and Black Mountain College, where he was influenced by Charles Olson and, of course, the abstract expressionists and their hard-drinking storytelling ways, something for which he himself would be well known. As he said, he left the saloon business, but not the saloonism. He was a saloonism guy. And he was initially shown by Martha Jackson in New York in 1959 and Castelli in 62. But what I learned doing this is he showed here in 1961 with Dlexi Gallery. A lot of LA people here will remember Dlexi Gallery in LA and then again in San Francisco. And then he happened to meet Larry Bell, or Larry Bell met him in 1962 at Ferris Gallery, which you all know about. And that is where their friendship began. And it was probably, Larry remembers, it might have been Ken Price's show. And I was going to say, how did you meet John Chamberlain? What do you remember about that meeting?
I remember Irving Blum introduced him to me. And John just bent over and stuck his tongue down my throat. That was our meeting. A room full of people. I sputtered and coughed for a while. Then I liked the guy.
I told you this was going to be about a bromance, the bromance of Larry and John. And John had come down here. Did you meet? John had come here with Neil Williams.
Yeah.
What do you know about Neil Williams? Was you friend?
Well, I met John through Neil. They drove out after our first meeting at the Ferris Gallery. John and Neil drove out in LA to bring some sculptures to somebody. I think he was also hoping to set up some kind of an exhibition with Virginia Dwan. And John was pretty busy hustling with doing the things that you have to do to get stuff done. And Neil didn't really have much to do except keep John amused. And he hung out at my place a lot. He was a great guy, a terrific artist, and very funny. He was also part Navajo. And when I moved to New Mexico, before I moved to New Mexico, we took a trip to a place, I can't remember the name of it, but near the Four Corners where he grew up. And his uncle had a trading post out there. And I got to know some of the family. And his uncle gave him a rifle that they used to go hunting with. And John gave it to me because guns were frowned upon in New York. And so, anyways, I still have it stuck in a closet somewhere.
Oh, that's really cool. You still have that. And yes, Neil Williams was known for the shaped canvas. He was good friends with Frank Stella, and he was also very good friends with Mickey Ruskin, who would later open Max's Kansas City, where there'd be a lot of collective goodwill, if you were. And Chamberlain comes here, and he did show, in fact, in My Country 'Tis of Thee with Dwan in 1962, which is a show of a political orientation. But he was so well known, even by 1962, he was with Castelli. He had his first Guggenheim retrospective in 1972. I mean, he really had a very meteoric career because his work represented a kind of abstract metal sculpture that involved color. So he had melded color with form in a way that other sculptors hadn't done, and it was a timely moment. But I interviewed him in 1986 when he had his show at MoCA, and here's what he said, because I think it's relevant to what we're going to talk about today. John Chamberlain said, "I feel that what's fine about fine art is that it's unprecedented knowledge. An artist makes what he wants to see. It's part of the job. I like to stay away from ironclad attitudes, and that applies to myself and my materials. I feel strongly that one needs relief, that if you're doing a certain kind of art, you need to regularly change scale, materials, or attitude." So that brings us to him coming to live with you in Venice and how your relationship evolved. How did he end up, when he first moved in with you, how did that come about?
He was broke, and he had just his girlfriend had thrown him out. He had a girlfriend named Muffy something, and she was a chef in New York, and he was totally devastated by her desertion of their relationship, so I had a big room that I used to set up things, and I just gave it to him to stay there. And first thing he did was buy a big hunk of foam rubber and carve himself a bed in it. And I don't know whatever happened to that, but there's something similar in the exhibition. Yeah. John was big at, he made those things with one of those electric knives that you cut roast beef with, And he also, when he was around the studio, he wore no clothes except a tank T-shirt, And so you can imagine this guy with his ass up in the air carving away at a big loaf of foam rubber. He was a very funny guy, very, very funny guy.
And covered in tattoos. And his hair was always immaculately coiffed. He wore it long, and when I met him, he bleached it peroxide blonde, but he always wore it long, and half the time he had mutton chops or long mustaches,
Yeah.
He was very hair conscious.
Yeah.
And so he comes to live with you.
What's interesting, all the hair was on his head.
Well, you would know.
Yeah.
And he was very muscular.
No, he was very flabby.
Oh, was he? Wandering around with those tattoos, with all those tattoos. I only saw a few of those tattoos.
Well, I only remember the chicken and the pig that were on his feet. One was a chicken and one was a pig.
Oh, I didn't see those.
What?
I didn't see those. I only saw the ones had lots of tattoos, like Navy tattoos, not like cool tattoos like now, Navy tattoos.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to so he's living with you in Venice, and it's through you he meets the rest of your friends.
Pardon me?
Did he met some of the other Venice artists through you, I take it?
Yeah.
Who?
Yeah.
How did that evolve?
Billy Al and Moses and Craig and all those guys that hung around Ferris were. Walter was responsible for welcoming John around the gallery scene that they had going, and it was actually Irving that introduced me to John, and we just had to hit it off. He was just so totally spontaneous guy, totally spontaneous. There's no telling what he would do or say at any given time to set him off. I never saw him really get mad, except years later, when somebody owed him money, he was really pissed off at this guy. But he dared to owe him money.
Would it be an art dealer?
What?
Was it an art dealer?
I don't remember. No, I don't remember. He just was, there's Gwen and David over there.
Well, I will say that
I might have say I'm so happy to see so many of my friends that I don't see much anymore. Thank you all for coming.
And
appreciate
welcome, Larry. Absolutely, Larry and Larry's people. And since Larry lives most of the time, you live a lot of the time. You live a lot of the time in Taos.
Yes.
I think probably more than you do
I live
here.
all the time in Taos. I come here now and then. Now I used to come every 3 weeks. I had my routine of driving. I was working on a series of two-dimensional things, and I didn't really have room in my studio in Taos to do those things. And I found a very nice place in Venice that was not so far from the studio that I got evicted from, and I still have that place. Anyways,
The church, the First
Yeah,
Congregational Church
yeah,
on
right,
Ocean.
and
and Marine.
my routine was to come here, work for 3 weeks, go home, make more of the materials that I was doing these two-dimensional things with, and use them up, and then go home, make more. And it went on for about 5 years, and it was an incredible series. And the energy that was totally from the drive, I'm sure, was incredible. The energy that, I mean, it was possible. I wasn't so young then, and it was still possible to work, 20 hours and get a lot of stuff done.
Well, and Chamberlain also lived in Taos, right?
Yeah, when he came out to, he didn't live in Taos for very long. He can't remember too much about his living in Taos, actually.
He said that he liked to change studios every year and a half. So he'd live in New York. He'd change studios in New York 3 times or more. He would have a studio in Florida, a studio. He didn't need a studio in LA because he could live at Larry's.
Well, he was always welcome at
Yeah.
my place.
Tell me about I wanted to say one thing briefly, going back for people who don't know the history of LA art. So Larry's talking about Walter Hopps introducing John around to all of his friends from the Venice art scene that were showing in Paris. That would be Robert Irwin, and it would be exactly Ed Moses and different people in George Hearst. But a lot of those people, Walter Hopps would know them because a lot of those artists were actually in the Art of Assemblage show in 1961 at the Museum of Modern Art, done by Bill Seitz. And Walter Hopps and Bill Seitz were great friends, and John Chamberlain was in that show. So when John Chamberlain came out here, he had a history of already knowing some of the people who were living and working out here. And his integration here was really through assemblage sculpture, which is, of course, hugely prominent here through Ed Kienholz and Wals Berman, and that was very much how Ferris started with Walter Hopps. But when he comes to work with you, he also shows, he's already moving out of that dimension when he shows at Dwan in and by the way, so Virginia Dwan is another art gallery in LA that comes up and opens in Westwood, and shows a whole different kind of roster of artists from Ferris, but is a competitor for the most important art shows of that time in the 60s. And it opens on Lynbrook. And so John Chamberlain has a show there. These are not car parts sculptures. They're foam rubber knots, over 20 of them. And you probably remember that. So the foam rubber idea that he had from carving the sofa that was in Larry's studio, eventually he went and got foam rubber, and he would just manually torque them and tie them in knots or wrap them in with string. And he put there 20, more than 21 of them on pedestals. So you walked in the room, all you saw was a sea of like foam rubber knots that was widely praised in a surprising way, but very much a part of the use of new materials that was coming up at the time. And I think it's shortly after that, he works with even newer materials when he comes to work with you and start working with your systems, your vacuum-coated systems. What year do you think that starts?
Well, I didn't do any vacuum forming.
Not vacuum form, the coating systems that you're doing. How did the sculptures with John Chamberlain come about? How did these sculptures get made?
Well, he had some idea that he wanted to bring transparency into the structures that he was making, and so he had a bunch of plexi boxes made, square boxes, something like a pedestal for something else, and except out of clear acrylic, and he took them to had these things made and took them to somebody who had a big oven, like a car painter might use to bake the enamels on a car, and he put them in the oven until they got soft, and then he would go in. He'd get himself a heat suit and big gloves and so on, go into the oven itself and twist these things up when they got soft and drag them out and set them outside to cool, so they didn't go back to any memory that was inherent in the plastic. And they were really interesting and very much John. They were just terrific. Anyways, he wanted to put a surface on them that wasn't paint. So my equipment that I use on glass is essentially a high vacuum thermal evaporator, which means it's a tank that you can do things in that have to be done in an environment that has no air. And one of those things is the evaporation of metals to plate a surface. And at that time, I was using a lot of aluminum in the metal that I was depositing on things, and then overcoating it with a form of quartz called silicon monoxide. And the quartz was the layers were very thin, and the films interfered with the light that was reflected off of the enhanced surface of the plexiglass by the aluminum, made it brighter, in other words. And so the forms that he made were very spontaneously done. He'd just go in there and twist these things up, and when it looked like something that was no longer a box at all, he'd drag it out and let it cool. And then I brought him to my studio, and we set him into the tank. It's a big bottle, actually, a big stainless steel bottle. It's a 7-foot diameter and 12 foot between the dish ends. And inside the tank are electrical connections that you could heat various elements and heat them up to the point where they reached what's known as a vapor pressure. They evaporated, and whatever was in the system in proximity to the vapor stream got coated. Well, the convolutions of his forms caused some of the some of the coating to be very bright on the surface where it was thicker. And when we put the silicon monoxide on top of that, the areas that were heavily coated, brightly reflected, interfered with light. In other words, the reflection, the colors one saw when they looked at the piece was light waves that were being interfered with at wavelengths equivalent to the thickness of the deposit. Now, all that sounds like a bunch of hooey, but in fact, a good example of that is a little bit of gasoline on a puddle of water at a filling station. The reason you see those rainbow colors is because their thickness is equivalent to the wavelength in the visible spectrum where those colors live. And it's called interference colors. And if one can control the thickness of the silicon monoxide.
I see what's going on here. Let me fix your mic for you.
Look what happened.
I know.
Stuff like that would happen when Chamberlain was around. Anyways, the thickness of the various films, if you can control the thickness of the deposition, you control which color is reflected. And I never bothered with learning how to control the colors. I liked the random aspect of what happened when I did it. And there was an infinite number of variations that were available by multi-layering the things. In other words, evaporation of aluminum, and then the sublimation of silicon monoxide, and then a little more aluminum, and then a little more SiO, and so on. And everything we did was different and looked different from different angles, and there was no end to the variety that the activity of the surface gave, even though the surfaces were very sleek. And so if you go in to see the show, bear that in mind, that the curvature of the forms is what determines the spectral variation that's coming off to your eye. And you'll also notice that if you stand at one place and look at something and you see a blue, yellow, or something like that, and then move to an oblique angle, the color will shift. That's because the angle of reflection is always equal to the angle of incidence, and, or vice versa. Anyways, you shift the wavelength that you're looking at when you see the color change.
It's interesting you mentioned the color, because I asked Phyllis Tuckman, who's written a lot about John Chamberlain and interviewed him in the 70s for Art Forum, and she said, talk about color. And I said, well, these pieces don't look to have that much color. She said, they do have a lot of color. She said, and John's work is all about color, which he used with the colored car parts. And in fact, that's what you're saying, that actually he was very interested in the color principles of these sculptures, which when you first see them, you think more about their form. I thought more about their form and their transparency.
Well, John shopped around a lot to find parts for cars that were interesting for the compositions that he was planning to do. And it wasn't until later in his development of the sculptures that he got into painting them after they were made. I personally liked the stuff that he made that was just a beat up bumper from or fender from an old Chevy or something, and he banged it more until he got it sort of the shape he wanted, jumping up and down on him sometimes. And then he very spontaneously tack welded these things together. And John was probably the most spontaneous, improvisational, and intuitive sculptor I've ever known. And he made his decisions about how things work incredibly fast. No meditation involved. Just total sensate direction. And I really admired anybody that could do that, because I was way too fussy with the way I did things. But in fact, a lot of my fussiness had to do with the stability of what I was trying to do. And it was one of those strange kind of things where you don't like yourself for doing something a certain way, but you sure like what you're doing.
Well, what you do is we're talking earlier about the delicacy of the surfaces, and I was talking about the difference between, I think of John Chamberlain truly as a very loose and combustible figure, and I was wondering how his loose and combustible personality worked with this, I wouldn't exactly, maybe I would call it.
This anal retentive technique?
yes, or this kind of, did either of you think of them as collaborations?
Well, at times I thought of it as pure torture. And because it took a lot of energy to do these things, not just the energy that it took to make his oven bake these pieces of acrylic so that he could bend them, but the energy that it took to run the equipment that I was providing for him, and the studio maintenance and all that stuff that took a lot of calories to keep those things going. And my feelings were that he should have been more protective of the technique, so that what he saw in the pieces was something that you'd always see in the pieces. But when I told him, we should probably coat these things in a clear lacquer to clean them, let it dry, and then coat them with the metals that I just described, and then coat that with some kind of a hard film so it protected the thing. His response was, I don't want to do that. We don't have to do that. And so that was it. We did what he wanted, and the evidence is here.
Now, where was all this taking place?
In Venice Beach.
This is in Venice Beach. So he was living with you in Venice Beach while these were being made?
I'm not sure if he was living. He lived there for a while when we weren't working on his stuff too, and he was doing things like carving little rubber things, and during the time that we were coating the plastic, he was around, but that didn't take that long. It was maybe what took a long time was the forming of the objects prior to the deposition, and then when he finally had enough of them to satisfy his need for doing stuff, he brought them in to me, and we would play with them.
It's interesting because he was here at that same time. Part of the time he was living in Malibu on his own. Part of the time he was living at Virginia Dwan's house in Malibu around that time as well.
Yeah, Neil was there too.
Yes, many people came out from New York and lived or stayed with Virginia Dwanner in her guest house in Malibu over the years, and she would show their work. But it's interesting you mentioned the rubber pieces and these pieces being around the same time, because they feel like they're coming from that a kind of tactility and a molding. And with the foam pieces, he talks quite a bit about wanting them to be molded and kneaded, and he talks about the sensual nature of that, the fleshiness of that. But I'm not sure the plexiglass has the same feeling for him. Or what do you think?
I'm sure it didn't.
Because he just had to basically push them gently.
Yeah. He was looking to invent new stuff. He wanted to do things he had not seen before, which is what I think most artists want to do, is make something they haven't seen before. And however the work develops, each step in the process is something I haven't seen, even if it's almost invisible to the visitors. That I think the search is to try and do something you've not seen before.
Well, that's certainly true of you and of him, of both of you, probably and all good artists. Now let's ask a little bit.
Well, I've actually, there's the whole thing about the light and space movement, which I've considered. I have to think about this. I like the idea of being identified with something, just because it gives me access to another group of people who are interested in something. But in fact, I really never thought of myself as a light and space artist, because everything I did had weight and mass, and it sat on the floor or sat on a clear pedestal. I mean, the real light and space artists were people like Irwin and Turrell and Wheeler, and that were really investigating the emptiness of something as a solid thing. And that wasn't my trip.
I'm so glad you're talking about it, because I just happened to be talking about this the other night with a dealer you had for a long time, Frank Lloyd, and we were talking about how, because people get categorized as a movement, there are a lot of assumptions, especially by people who don't live in LA and don't know the history very well. And yes, and you get lumped into this sort of rubric, and it's true that the work you do is, well, it's sculpture, and...
Well, I made a few rooms that explored that arena. And I enjoyed the process of them, but they left too much time to worry about things. You build the room, and then it takes time to accumulate enough money to make another one, and so on and so forth. I like the spontaneity of being able to keep doing things, because if I'm not doing something that had a tactile relationship with me, I go crazy. And boredom is a very dangerous thing for me. And so I have to be busy doing things, or at least thinking I'm doing things. And somebody once told me that the quality of somebody's life is really totally dependent on the number of options they think they have. And I love that thought. If you don't think you've got anywhere to go, then you're pretty low on the totem pole.
I like that. And I also, your work, this is a good transition to the fact that you also, like by 1965, you're showing at Pace Gallery, which is a big deal in those days, because you're an LA artist and you're one of a few who get picked up at Pace to have your debut in New York, which is very well received. And at that point, your work is also connected to minimalism, which is the other way it's thought of. And what was it? What year? And then you moved to New York for a period.
Well, I had a show in New York, and a one-person show in New York in '65 at the Pace Gallery. and we shipped these sculptures, these cubes that I had been working on in Venice, but the technical aspect of them, the coatings that I was using, were being done by a man who made optical devices for Disney Studios, and he made lenses and special reflectors and so on for the film industry. And I, at one point in the development of this things, got tired of scraping a pattern off of a mirror that I bought from the thrifty drugstore, let's say, and to get the kind of effect I wanted, I had to scrape away the mirror exactly the same on two pieces and put them back to back so that it was reflective on both sides, and you could see through it at the same time with a structured pattern or drawing, whatever you want to call it, an imagery of something. And somebody told me about a process called front surface mirrors. And I looked it up in the yellow pages and found a guy that did front surface mirrors out in Burbank. And I drove out there to see him, and I said, when I went in, I understand you can make a mirror that's reflective on both sides from one piece of glass. And he said, yeah, and he pulled out a little chip and turned it over. It was exactly what I was looking for. So,
New York.
This was in Burbank, in California here. Anyways, I made the pieces, and they were pretty interesting, and I took them to New York for the show. Well, we sent them to New York with about 6 weeks before the show was to open, and sadly, several of them broke in transit. Why they broke, I'm not sure. I wasn't sure then, because I thought the packing was fantastic on them. It occurred to me we had enough time to repair the parts if I could find two outfits that one could replace the broken glass, and the other that could replicate the coated surface on new piece of glass. So we found those two places in New York, and we repaired the pieces, and the guy charged me a lot of money to do this work because he was not an optical coater like the people that I was used to. He was a novelty metallizer. In other words, he made Christmas tree ornaments. He would mirrorize little glass balls and dip them in dyes so that they would end up on a Christmas tree being bright green, bright yellow, and so on. And but the process was the same as the optical guy that I was using. And he suggested I could do it myself because it was, he could imagine how expensive it was to work with this man who was doing it for me. And the show was really successful. I had really not sold anything, and then before the show opened, Pace had sold everything. And I mean, it blew my mind. And that's why I decided maybe I should stay in New York, you know. And that's what I did. I got a studio, I bought that equipment, and the man who sold it to me came in after I got it installed in this little studio I found on the Lower East Side, and he came in to the studio. We had it set up. I'd been waiting a week or two for it for somebody to show me how it worked. I had no idea what this thing was that I had just bought for $3,500 in 1965. And he comes in, and he looks around. He says, yeah, he was from Eastern Europe somewhere. He says, yeah, this will do very nice. And I said, great, Dr. Koenig, when do I get my lesson? He says, right now. And he reached into his overcoat and pulls out a book called Vacuum Deposition of Thin Films, sticks it in my stomach, and says, you start on page 1, and he left. And I'm standing there holding this book, looking at this thing that looked like a big Ronson lighter. He called me the next day he says, don't be mad at me. I'm sending you a guy who worked for me and so that started. A fellow showed up who was an outpatient from the Jacobi tubercular clinic. And he was a walking skeleton. He was not in very good shape. But he came Tuesdays and Thursdays. I gave him $20 for each session and paid for his lunch and his taxi fare from wherever the Jacobi tubercular clinic was. And one day he didn't show up, and I called to see where he was, and he had died.
Oh.
And it was just me in the book after that,
Ooh, bummer.
It was a bummer. We really got scared, I said, what have I done? But
when you're in New York at this time, aren't you also in touch with John Chamberlain?
Yeah.
Because he lives he's down by South Park. He's also living in New York. John Chamberlain is also living in New York.
Yeah. I saw John and Neil all the time. And it was around, and Neil took me to a new bar that a friend, some guy he knew had opened. It was called Max's Kansas City. And that's where we hung out. And I remember one time coming into town, and the fellow who owned the bar, his name was Mickey Ruskin, and he stood outside. He stood outside and watched the door, and he wouldn't let anybody that looked like a tourist wanting to hang out where artists hung out, he wouldn't let them in. He said, sorry, we're full. The place might be empty. But they were full as far as those people were concerned, and he'd be standing there right when a bunch of really shaggy-looking guys would just walk right in, and the people from the Bronx were quite upset that they couldn't go in when it looked like it was empty. Anyways. It was a great place. It was a lot of fun. And that's one time I came into town and I threw my bags at a hotel that I was staying at and went immediately to Max's, and Mickey was standing outside, and he says, hi, Larry, John and Neil are over at their usual table with 2 other bozos. And I went to the table. I knew where that was. And one of the bozos was de Kooning, and the other bozo was William Burroughs. And everybody was totally shit-faced. Neil jumps up when I walk in, and he throws me into the booth and wedges me in between John and him, and they start pouring cognac. Boy, I still have a hangover from that night. There was a kind of funny camaraderie that existed around there at those times.
Were you able to trade your art for drinks at the bar?
Yeah.
Chamberlain did too. All the artists did,
Yeah, Mickey was great about that. He never let any artist go without food or drink, ever. Made no difference how much money they owed him. He just was the deal. And it wasn't even a matter of trading. He just, anybody who came into his place, he took care of, whether they paid or not. So you can imagine how many deadbeats that probably were part of the scene. And Andy Warhol used to come in with his entourage, and there was a whole room at the back of Max's that he and his gang would go into, and it was sort of their room. And it was a funny time. You know.
Well, John, though, what I learned in my little brief research for this is in 1962, Andy Warhol has his first show at Ferris. In 1963, he has a show at Ferris, and he becomes infatuated with filmmaking, and he does his film about Tarzan and Jane here. And it turns out that John makes a cameo in this film, along with, a lot of other, figures in the LA art world at the time. And I didn't know that he'd actually been involved in Warhol's film scene. And then I found out he was involved with Ultraviolet, too. So there were parts of John Chamberlain's life I didn't know about. I know much more about your life than his life.
The Secret Life of Hernando Cortez.
Yeah, they made his own film.
Was his, Yeah, it was a very funny film.
Yeah. Where he did, well, you've made your own films too. I mean, John made films, you made films.
No, I never made.
Well, you were in films.
I may have been in them, but I
Yeah,
never
you were in films. There was a time when people could do films like that. How are we doing? Is it a good time to ask for questions, or should I just carry on? Okay. I've just been carrying on. Is there anyone here who has a question for Larry, or indirectly a question about John for us? Yes, Michael?
Hello, Larry.
Speak up.
Hello.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. I was following your work when the Red Sea were young.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I don't hear right.
I said I was following your work when the Red Sea was young.
When the Red Sea was young. He's been following you since the Red Sea was young. Okay, it's a long time.
And I was just thinking, looking at the show, I mean, right now it's no big deal seeing all these cubes and the rest of it, but in 1965, in 1962, or early 60, when you started, this is a huge deal. This is like major, So, like so many artists of your generation, was disappeared in the recent time and now come back again. I have a technical question to ask you. You started your work with very small pieces, and your late work now, of course, become much larger. Do you have a problem in learn how to make a big ones and vice versa?
Yes, is the answer.
What is the
to
problem?
that. Well, the handling of the material turns out to be a problem. We want to carry on with the one piece leads to another piece, and I wanted to sort of carry the format of what I've been working on into a scale that encompasses your peripheral vision when you get close enough to it. So the piece might reflect the walls here and what's behind and over there and so on, but the point being that what your eye saw was nothing other than what was influenced by the sculpture. And so we started a new project a few years ago with a new material that came onto the market, which was a form of laminated glass that is colored various colors, and the glass is actually clear glass that has a laminate film in the middle of it that is a very specific red or green or yellow or such. And we wanted to take that kind of material and change the nature of how the light was either reflected, absorbed, or transmitted. And those are the three natural qualities of a piece of glass. It reflects, absorbs, and transmits light all at the same time. And our plan was to apply films of material to the surface of the glass that changed either all of those things or some of those things or whatever it was. It wanted to look right. And so what we found was that the techniques for doing this new kind of process in a new kind of media was totally feasible, except that how to handle the stuff became the big problem. We don't know how to scrupulously clean both sides of the piece of glass that weighs close to 450 pounds and not touch it at the same time. And I didn't want to spend a king's ransom on getting another piece of apparatus that would do that. I keep thinking, oh, there's got to be a way we can do this. And so we started making small models, and some of them might be here at the gallery that you can see. And we're now expanding the models. They started off being, say, this big, and now they're this big, and now they're this big. And at some point, I figure we'll be able to get close enough to how to handle them to make something 6 foot by 8 foot. Yes. The parts. So all of my work is based on right angles, and so if I can put a couple of 6 by 8 foot pieces together, that becomes pretty big. And that's what we're shooting for.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 comments, and I'm off.
We've lost you again. Alexander to the rescue.
I wouldn't worry about the cleaning. Just ask Jeff Kuhn, all the surfaces that his sculpture has. And also ask Ed Reinhardt, also surface most delicate. Second one is that you were talking about your shipment to Pace in 1965, and they all broke. And just reminded me of Duchamp, The Bride Descending the Staircase. That piece was also shipped and went to pieces, shattered. And Duchamp, of course, kept that controlled accident, which became a masterpiece. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Well, we finally found out why the pieces broke. It had to do not with the clumsiness of the handling. It had to do with the pressure differential between sea level and how high an airplane goes. When the parts, when the pieces get to a certain altitude, the pressure inside pushes the glass. And because the pressure outside of the piece has been reduced by the altitude that the airplane flies at. And that's why they have climate control and pressure control. But in 1965, that wasn't the case on luggage departments of the airplanes that were traveling. The passengers traveled in air compensated comfort, but the suitcases didn't, and that's where my pieces were transported with the rest of the luggage of the thing. And so they broke because they exploded, really. And we learned that the hard way. When I did a show at LA Louvre Gallery, and we drove the things out. We knew about the pressure differential, but we didn't know how much pressure you needed to keep them from doing that. And so we put breather holes in the pieces in the corners that you couldn't see. And in fact, the tiny holes, which might have been 20 thousandths of an inch diameter that were in the corners, all those pieces survived just fine, but the ones that were 15 thousandths of an inch diameter didn't survive. And so you got to let the air get back into the things to transport them that way. And in our case, we're not talking about shipping them by air. We drove them from northern New Mexico to Venice Beach, to Peter's gallery. I had a fantastic crew, and we packed those things so carefully, and they took them out, and they were broken. Some of them were broken. And it wasn't until we realized that the ones that broke had a smaller breather hole than the ones that didn't break.
Because of the altitude at Taos.
Yeah,
Same
we're
thing.
7,000 feet there, and this is sea level. The difference in pressure across the 6 sides of a 36-inch cube is close to 10 tons between 7,000 feet and sea level.
And you thought making art was easy. I also want to say, Michael, to your Duchamp point, yes, there's a documentary about Duchamp comes to Pasadena, airing on KCET in 2 weeks. Larry is interviewed about Duchamp coming to his studio and visiting him and his experience of going to New York to visit Duchamp. And even if you've heard the story, listen to it again, because it's a great story. And it's a great part of LA's history as well. I want another question. Oh, lots of questions. Come on, Alexandria. Oh, there are questions everywhere here.
Hi, hello. I just wanted to ask a question which is somewhat emotive. Looking back, what is the most important for you, the most important pieces that you've made or period that you've been through, and why?
Well, that's a great question. At different times, there's a different kind of rush that you get from doing things. When Eric Orr and I don't know how many of you remember the work of Eric Orr, a great artist who lived here in LA, and he and I collaborated on a project. Now, why did I bring this up? Now, see, when you get old, you start memories don't.
The solar.
What?
The solar.
Yeah, the solar fountain project. Anyways, it was a project in that we decided we would work on something together, and Eric was very much involved with the metaphysical aspects of different types of things, and including gold being one of them. And the only thing I knew about gold was that it was a good reflector of infrared energy. So, to mix it all up, we decided that his interest in gold and my knowledge of what gold did, that we had to use heat as part of our collaboration. And so we designed a big bowl that was 30-foot diameter that had made of, I don't remember how many facets of 5-foot by 10-foot panels that were the kind of glass that they use in high-rise to reflect the heat out, to lower the air conditioning costs. So there's a material that you can buy that is called a high emissive glass or something like that. Anyways, it reflected the sun's light onto a mist of fog that was created by a pumping system that was developed for the protection of the citrus industry. A blanket of fog would, when a frost was imminent, a blanket of fog would cover the trees and protect them from freezing. Well, we took this system and put it inside this glass bowl that reflected the sun's heat onto this moving cloud of fog. And it did the most amazing things because fog was really, tiny airborne particles of water. When the heat reflected from one of the facets of the bowl, when the water passed into the projected heat, reflected heat, it evaporated and rainbows and things happened. Just all of a sudden a flash of intense color. If you were standing in the right place, it just is constantly moving. Anyways, we actually managed to have the piece. We found a client in the city of Denver. Diane Vanderlip remembers this whole story very well. And she was a curator at the museum. Anyways, what we didn't know, the city offered us a dozen or so different locations, and we drove around and looked at all these places, and we finally chose one that was right in the downtown area. That was, if you're familiar with Denver, the big high-rises in the downtown area, and there was a empty area right on Spear Avenue and Arapahoe, which had no big buildings around it. So the idea being that this bowl that we wanted to put up would not ever be in the shadow of a big building. Well, we put it up, and but what we didn't know was that that particular piece of property, which was just adjacent to the Center for the Performing Arts, the kingpin of the performing arts considered that property his to have his, to do, it was, he directed the Center for Performing Arts, it was the place where he was going to do his Shakespeare things in the summer and so on and so forth. The property belonged to the city, and when we said we wanted to do it there, the city was delighted. What we didn't know was that this man and the head of the Department of Recreation and Parks in Denver were at war over things all the time. And so the development of the site after the presence of the fountain installation, he wouldn't allow anything to happen. He couldn't, no benches was put there, no maintenance on the place, and eventually the vandals started heaving cinder blocks over the thing into the, breaking the plumbing that, and eventually the city had a meeting, because just about all of the public art in Denver at that time was in terrible condition, and the mayor formed a panel to decide what the most critical pieces, and ours was number one, needing help. And the committee said, okay, we have to fix this. We spent close to a year with several architects and engineers, and they just decided, mayor decided it was too expensive to maintain, and so they took it down. And that was the end of it.
That's a very good
You win
question.
some and you lose some, you know.
That's a very good question, and a story I don't think very many people know. And a warning, like a
I think we have time for one more
one
question.
more. Okay, there's a question there of somebody.
Hi, Larry.
Hi.
I wasn't able to follow you since 1965 because I wasn't born yet. But I always hear stories about Venice Beach in the 1960s and 1970s. I always feel like I'm the person in Midnight Paris, that like I've already missed the golden era of Venice Beach. Do you think Venice is still happening?
What a question. I like Venice. I mean, I still have a studio there, and I love to come out. I love being by the ocean. I got the bulk of my friends are still out here, and I don't know how it's going to survive. You know, with rents went through the roof, and a lot of it had to do with the company called Snapchat that decided it wanted to take over all of Venice and had so much money they didn't care how much money they spent to get all of the property in Venice in their hands, either by lease or by ownership. And rents went up impossibly, and a lot of businesses went out because of that, and they eventually just deserted it and moved to someplace else. But the damage was done, and let's face it, there's only so much beachfront. It's inevitable that it was going to cost a lot of money to be around there. And more than once I've thought about how much it cost me to just to keep the studio when I'm not working there, to make some attempt to pay for my presence there. But I like it too much to give it up, so as long as I can afford it, I'm keeping it. And I have very good landlords. It's a Christian Science church, and they've been very good to me. They're not supposed to be in business anyway, so the profit motive is not in their thing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I can do.
Alexander, what's your verdict? Another one or not? Okay, we will wrap it up with that, but you can certainly ask more questions by just walking up to us and talking to us after this. And
You mean we're through?
well, we're not quite through because, Larry, show him your shirt. We decided if it got boring, Larry could always just show you his shirt. But it wasn't boring because it was Larry. And thank you all for coming and bringing stories of your own. Got it, babe?